In the frigid darkness of Alaska, where a howling blizzard threatens to swallow all life, a lone cabin stands defiant in the deep woods. But as the temperature plunges to unimaginable depths, a strange sound pierces the black night, a low, guttural growl from something that shouldn't be awake. What's lurking out there, and who would dare confront it? Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. Thank you. Let's get into it. The Alaskan night was no longer just cold. It was a snarling, invisible beast clawing through the wooden walls of Ken Carter's tiny cabin. Outside, the frost-encrusted window framed a thermometer that dangled helplessly, frozen at -40 degrees Fahrenheit, as if it, too, had surrendered to the relentless chill spilling down from the north. Inside, Ken, 45, stood motionless in the dim glow of his flickering fireplace, his breath escaping in fragile white wisps that dissolved into the dry, biting air. 5 years he'd lived in this remote corner of Alaska, 4 hours from the nearest town over snow-choked roads, a solitary speck in a wilderness that cared nothing for human presence. The cabin creaked under the wind's assault, a mournful sound that echoed the isolation wrapping around him like a second skin. Its weathered planks, scarred by countless storms, held the weight of his choice to flee Seattle's clamor, a life once filled with the click of camera shutters and the hum of city streets. Now his world was reduced to this, a single room where the dying embers cast long shadows across walls lined with photographs. Wolves mid-hunt, moose wading through icy rivers, bears rearing against the sky, his silent companions, frozen in moments he'd stolen from the wild. They stared back at him, their glass-eyed gazes a quiet accusation in the stillness. Ken's hands, roughened by years of survival, traced the edge of his weathered desk where a satellite phone sat charged but useless against the storm brewing outside. 50 miles to the nearest ranger station, a lifeline he knew couldn't reach through the thickening whiteout. The weather radio crackled to life, its mechanical voice cutting through the wind's howl. A storm system, record lows, winds strong enough to snap pines like twigs. His pulse quickened, a familiar knot tightening in his chest. He'd faced winters here before, but this was different. The air itself felt heavy, oppressive, as if nature had turned its full, unforgiving gaze upon him. He moved to the window, pressing a gloved hand against the glass. The cold seeped through, stinging his palm, while beyond, the world dissolved into a swirling void of snow. No stars, no horizon, just an endless, suffocating white. His ears popped faintly, a sign of the dropping pressure, and the birds he'd heard at dawn had long fallen silent. Ken knew these omens. They whispered of danger in a language he'd learned to heed. His father's voice echoed in his mind, low and steady. "Nature doesn't forgive carelessness, son." Those words had been his compass, guiding him through blizzards and thin ice, keeping him alive when others might have faltered. Yet tonight, that wisdom felt fragile. The fire sputtered, its warmth barely reaching the room's edges, and Ken's gaze drifted to a photo of a lone bear, its fur dusted with snow. He'd taken it years ago, crouched in a thicket, heart pounding as the animal's breath clouded the air. That bear hadn't known he was there, hadn't needed him. Now, as the wind rattled the cabin's bones, he wondered if he'd ever truly belonged here, or if he'd just been a trespasser all along, tolerated until nature decided otherwise. His routine kicked in, a lifeline against the rising dread. He checked the generator's hum, its steady pulse of faint comfort, then stacked more logs by the hearth, their resinous scent grounding him. Water sloshed into containers, a precaution against frozen pipes, and he tested the emergency lantern's glow. Each task was deliberate, mechanical, a shield against the chaos outside. But as he paused, hands trembling slightly from the cold, or perhaps something deeper, he felt it, a gnawing unease, sharp and unnameable, clawing at the edges of his calm. The storm wasn't just a test of his supplies or his shelter. It was a mirror reflecting the man he'd become. Patient, solitary, hardened by necessity, yet softened by the wild beauty he chased. Ken exhaled, fogging the glass, and stared into the tempest. The thermometer's needle wouldn't budge, but he didn't need it to tell him the truth. This night would demand more than routine. It would strip him bare, force him to confront the thin line between survival and surrender. And as the wind screamed louder, a primal wail that shook the walls, he felt the weight of his isolation crash down. Not just a man alone, but a soul teetering on the edge of something vast, something alive, something that might not let him go unscathed. The storm descended like a living thing, its first icy tendrils snaking through the Alaskan wilderness as Ken Carter stood in his cabin, the weight of the weather radio's warning pressing against his ribs. The voice crackled through static. Record lows, winds exceeding 50 miles an hour, expect prolonged isolation. Each word landed like a stone, sinking into the pit of his stomach. He'd heard forecasts before, braced for winters that turned the world to ice, but this was no ordinary squall. The thermometer outside had dipped past minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, its mercury trembling before freezing solid, and the wind howled with a fury that shook the cabin's bones, rattling the photographs on the walls like restless ghosts. Ken's breath clouded the air as he moved, deliberate and silent, his shadow stretching long across the wooden floor in the firelight's dim flicker. 5 years in this desolate outpost had carved survival into his marrow. Every morning a ritual of checking, securing, preparing. Now those habits surged to life with an urgency that bordered on desperation. He hauled the generator closer to the porch, its growl a defiant pulse against the storm's roar, and tested the fuel line with numb fingers, the cold biting through his gloves. The wind shoved back, a brutal gust slipping through the doorframe, stinging his face with shards of snow. He cursed under his breath, the sound swallowed by the tempest. Inside, the cabin felt smaller, the walls closing in as he stacked firewood until the pile loomed like a barricade. The scent of pine resin filled the air, sharp and grounding, but it couldn't mask the creeping dread. He filled water jugs, the slosh of liquid a fragile promise against pipes he'd wrapped in heat tape. Pipes he knew might still betray him. His emergency lantern flared to life, casting a stark glow across his desk, where the satellite phone sat, fully charged yet impotent. 50 miles to help through a whiteout no ranger could breach. The realization tightened his throat. He was alone, truly alone, with only his wits in this trembling shelter between him and oblivion. The wind found every crack, whistling an eerie tune that clawed at his nerves, a sound he'd never grown used to. Ken paused, leaning against the desk, his calloused hands gripping its edge as his father's voice surfaced again. Nature doesn't forgive carelessness, son. It wasn't just advice, it was a mantra, etched into him through years of near misses and hard-earned lessons. He'd seen trees split by frost, rivers freeze mid-flow, animals vanish under snowdrifts. Carelessness killed. Yet as he glanced at the frost-laced window, the world beyond a swirling abyss, he felt something shift, a flicker of fear, raw and unbidden, gnawing at his resolve. He turned up the fireplace, feeding it logs until the flames roared, their heat a fleeting shield against the chill seeping through the walls. The storm's first wave hit then, snow falling in thick, blinding sheets, reducing visibility to a smothering nothing. Ken pressed his face to the glass, eyes straining against the chaos. The pines swayed violently, their branches cracking like gunfire, and the air thickened with a stillness beneath the wind, a stillness that screamed danger. His ears popped again, the pressure dropping fast, and the silence of the birds he'd noted that morning now felt like a death knell. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was a siege. Ken's heart thudded, a steady drumbeat against the storm's wild rhythm. He moved faster, checking the backup heater, its hum a lifeline he clung to. His hands shook, not from cold, but from the weight of what loomed outside. He'd prepared for storms, yes, but this one carried a menace he couldn't name, a force that mocked his routines, his walls, his illusions of control. The photographs on the walls, wolves, moose, bears, seemed to watch him now, their captured strength a taunt against his growing fragility. Standing there, the fire's warmth barely touching his back, Ken felt the cabin tremble as another gust slammed against it. The wind's howl rose to a scream, a primal cry that drowned out the radio's fading warnings. He gripped a water jug, knuckles white, and stared into the whiteout. This storm wasn't just testing his supplies or his shelter. It was peeling back the layers of the man he'd built, exposing the fear he'd buried beneath years of solitude. He'd chosen this life, this wild, but now it chose him back, and the rules he lived by felt suddenly, terrifyingly thin. The night stretched ahead, dark and endless, and as the cabin groaned under nature's wrath, Ken knew this was only the beginning. The storm's fury peaked just after midnight, a relentless howl that battered Ken Carter's cabin like a beast clawing for entry. Inside, the fire sputtered, its warmth a frail shield against the -45 degrees Fahrenheit cold seeping through the walls. Ken sat hunched in his chair, the satellite phone's silence mocking him, when a sound pierced the wind's roar, a deep, guttural rumble, faint but unmistakable. His breath caught, heart lurching as years of photographing wildlife snapped into focus. A bear. In February, when every bear in Alaska should be locked in hibernation's embrace. Something was wrong, terribly, impossibly wrong. He grabbed his flashlight, its beam slicing through the cabin's gloom, and crept to the window. The glass was a sheet of ice, his reflection a ghostly blur against the swirling snow beyond. He pressed the light to the pane, straining to see, the cold stinging his fingertips through his gloves. Then he saw them, three shapes, dark and staggering, emerging from the whiteout like phantoms. A mother bear, massive even in her hunched exhaustion, and two cubs, tiny shadows clinging to her side. Their movements were slow, labored, a pitiful crawl against the wind's savage push. Ken's chest tightened, a mix of awe and dread flooding him. He'd spent years tracking bears, hours crouched in blinds, camera clicking as they fished rivers or wrestled in meadows. He knew their power, their grace, but this was different. The mother's stride, usually a rolling thunder of muscle, was a broken shuffle, her head low, her fur crusted with ice. The cubs huddled close, shivering violently, their small bodies dwarfed by the storm's cruelty. They were too young, late-born, frail, doomed in this cold without shelter. Ken's beam trembled as it followed them, illuminating the desperation in their faltering steps. No bear would drag her cubs into this unless her den had failed her, unless survival had turned predator into prey. They drew closer, drawn to the cabin's faint promise of refuge. The mother pawed at the snow near the porch, her massive claws scraping uselessly against the wind-whipped drifts. Ken's breath fogged the glass, his pulse a frantic drumbeat. He'd read the manuals, heard the warnings. Bears near humans mean danger. A mother protecting her young could kill with a single swipe, even half dead from cold. Yet as he watched her strength fading with every futile dig, he saw no threat. Only a mother's anguish, raw and piercing, cutting through the storm's din. The cubs stumbled, one collapsing into a drift, a tiny heap nearly lost to the snow. The mother nudged it up, her snout gentle but shaking, her low moan a sound that tore at Ken's core. Desperation distilled into a single, haunting note. The second cub wavered, its legs buckling, and she turned to shield it, her body a crumbling wall against the wind. Ice gleamed on her fur, her eyes glazing as hypothermia sank its teeth deeper. Ken pressed closer to the window, his flashlight's beam a lifeline he couldn't retract. They were dying, right there, feet from his door, a family unraveling in slow, agonizing silence. His mind raced, years of observation clashing with the scene unfolding. He'd photographed bears in blizzards, marveling at their resilience, but never like this, never so broken, so human in their frailty. The mother's gaze lifted, locking with his through the glass, and time stopped. There was no growl, no bared teeth, just exhaustion, a plea so primal it stripped away the rules he'd lived by. Don't interfere. Let nature run its course. That's what he'd always believed, what his camera demanded. But as the cubs' shivers slowed, their breaths shallowing into faint wisps, that belief cracked. The wind screamed louder, rattling the cabin, but Ken barely heard it. His hand hovered over the door handle, trembling not from cold, but from the weight of what he saw. A mother fighting with her last breath, 2 lives fading before they'd begun. His father's voice whispered, "Nature doesn't forgive." Yet what was this if not nature begging for mercy? The mother bear slumped, her body curling around her cubs, a final shield against the inevitable. Ken's throat burned, tears pricking his eyes, tears he hadn't shed in years. This wasn't just wildlife anymore. This was a mirror, reflecting something he couldn't unsee, a desperation he understood, a fight he couldn't ignore. The wind shrieked through the Alaskan night, a banshee's wail that battered Ken Carter's cabin as the mother bear and her cubs huddled against his porch, their forms half buried in snow. Inside, the fire's glow cast jagged shadows across the room, but its warmth couldn't touch the chill gripping Ken's soul. The flashlight in his hand trembled, its beam fixed on the trio beyond the frosted window. 3 lives slipping away in agonizing silence. The cubs lay still now, curled into their mother's side, their shivers fading into a deadly calm. The mother's massive frame sagged, her breath a shallow rasp, ice crusting her fur like a shroud. Her eyes, glazed yet piercing, met his through the glass, and in that gaze Ken saw a resignation that shattered him. His hand rested on the door handle, the cold metal biting into his palm, anchoring him to a moment that felt suspended between sanity and madness. Every rule he'd lived by, every lesson carved into him by 5 years in the wild, screamed at him to stay put. Bears are dangerous. Mothers protect with fury. Don't open the door. He'd seen it in his lens. A grizzly tearing through a rival, blood staining the snow, power unleashed in an instant. Even weakened, she could kill him. Her desperation a spark that needed no strength to ignite. The ranger manuals, the warnings, his father's voice. "Nature doesn't forgive carelessness, son." They roared in his skull, a chorus of reason chaining him to safety. But reason crumbled as he watched the cubs' chests barely rise, their tiny bodies surrendering to the cold's merciless grip. The mother shifted, a feeble nudge to rouse them, her moan a broken plea that sliced through the wind and lodged in Ken's chest. He'd photographed hundreds of bears, majestic, untouchable, but never like this, never so frail, so achingly mortal. His breath fogged the glass, his heart a frantic thud against his ribs. He'd built this life on distance, on observing without meddling, letting nature's brutal ballet play out. Yet here, inches away, that distance dissolved, replaced by a pull he couldn't name. A pull that felt like guilt, like duty, like something human staring back from those dying eyes. The storm raged harder, the cabin groaning as if it too felt the weight of his choice. Ken's mind spun, a storm of its own. He could wait it out. Let them fade, let the snow bury their story. It'd be safer, smarter, the wilderness way. But as the mother's head drooped, her gaze still locked on him, he saw more than a bear. He saw a mother, her last act a shield for her young, her trust, or surrender, laid bare in that look. His throat burned, a sob he swallowed back, and his fingers tightened on the handle. What's survival worth if it means watching this? The question clawed at him, louder than the wind, sharper than the cold. He thought of his camera, idle on the desk, years of capturing life without touching it. That was his creed. Witness, don't interfere. But the cubs weren't moving now, their breaths so faint they might already be gone, and the mother's eyes began to close, her strength bleeding into the snow. Ken's chest heaved, a war raging between instinct and empathy. Stay safe, stay alive. Yet another voice rose, soft but insistent. What if this were you? What if no one came? His father's words twisted. Carelessness wasn't just action, it was inaction too, letting life slip away when he could act. The wind slammed the cabin, a branch snapping outside like a gunshot, jolting him. The mother bear didn't flinch. Too far gone, her body a crumbling fortress. Ken's hand shook, sweat beading despite the cold. He'd faced storms, hunger, isolation, but this was a precipice he'd never imagined. Opened the door, and he risked everything. His home, his life, his rules. Stay inside and he'd carry their deaths forever, a weight heavier than any storm. Her eyes flickered, a final spark, and Ken felt it. The line between man and wild blurring, his humanity surging past fear. He exhaled, a ragged breath that fogged the air, and gripped the handle tighter. The decision wasn't logic. It was a cry from somewhere deep, a defiance of the rules that had kept him alive, but now felt like chains. The cubs were still, the mother fading, and time was a blade at his throat. Now or never. The storm's howl peaked, a deafening crescendo, and in that chaos, Ken made his choice. Not as a survivor, but as a man who couldn't look away. The cabin door creaked open, a jagged scream swallowed by the storm's roar, as Ken Carter stepped into the frozen night. The wind slammed into him, a wall of ice and fury that drove snow into his eyes, stinging like needles against his exposed skin. His breath froze in his lungs, each exhale a desperate gasp, but his gaze locked on the bears. 3 dark shapes huddled against his porch, their forms nearly lost to the drifts. The mother bear's head lifted, a sluggish tilt, her nostrils flaring as she caught his scent. Her eyes, dulled by exhaustion, flickered with a spark of awareness, and Ken's heart seized. This was it, the moment where survival hung on a thread, his life balanced against hers. He moved slowly, boots crunching through the snow, the cold clawing up his legs despite his layers. The flashlight trembled in his grip, its beam cutting a frail path through the whiteout, illuminating the cubs, motionless under a crust of ice, their tiny chests barely rising. The mother's massive frame loomed, a shadow of power reduced to a shivering wreck, her fur matted with frost. Ken's voice broke the silence, low and soft, a whisper against the wind. "It's all right." Words she couldn't understand, words for himself, a tether to sanity as he edged closer to death's jaws. He'd grabbed blankets from his emergency stash, their wool rough against his numb fingers, and now he cleared a path to the storage room door, each step a gamble. The wind shoved him, nearly toppling him into the snow, but he pressed on, scraping a trail from porch to shelter. The mother bear watched, her head swaying, her breath a ragged cloud. Ken's pulse thundered, every instinct screaming to run. She could kill you, one swipe, one misstep. But her gaze held no threat, only a weary question. He opened the storage room door, warm air rushing out, a fleeting fog in the frigid dark. The mother's nostrils twitched, sensing life in that heat, and her head lifted higher, a glimmer of strength reborn. Now came the risk that stopped his breath. Ken stepped within feet of her, the blankets heavy in his hands. She tensed, a ripple through her frame, and he froze, his life flashing in that heartbeat. Images of bears he'd photographed, their claws rending flesh, their roars splitting silence. But she didn't lunge. Her eyes tracked him, wary but spent, as he tossed a blanket over the cubs. It landed soft, covering their still forms, and for a terrifying second she bristled, muscles coiling, a mother's instinct flaring. Ken held his ground, breath held, every nerve alight. Then impossibly, she nosed the blanket closer, tucking it around her young, her snout trembling with effort. Relief crashed through him, sharp and dizzying. He laid another blanket nearer the door, a bridge of warmth, his fingers numb, his body screaming to retreat. The wind howled louder, a beast in rage, but Ken stayed, a statue in the storm. The mother bear struggled to her feet, legs shaking, a titan rising from ruin. She swayed, the cubs limp beneath the wool, and Ken stepped back, slow and deliberate, until he stood by the open door. Warmth poured out, a beacon in the black, and he waited, heart hammering, as she faced her choice. Her gaze shifted, cubs to door, door to him, a calculus of survival in those fading eyes. Then with a strength that stole his breath, she gripped the blanket in her teeth. Ken watched, awe strangling his fear, as she dragged her cubs toward the shelter. Each step was agony, her muscles quivering, her massive body a monument to maternal will. The wind clawed at her, snow swirling in her wake, but she pressed on, inch by inch, a mother defying death itself. The cubs slid over the snow, cocooned in wool, and Ken's chest ached. Pride, terror, wonder colliding as she neared the threshold. She paused, steam rising from her fur as warmth hit her bulk filling the doorway. One wrong move, one panic, and she could crush him, trap them all in this frozen hell. But she didn't falter. With a final shuddering pull, she crossed into the storage room, collapsing beside her cubs, her body curling around them like a fortress. Ken edged forward, hands shaking as he eased the door shut, the click deafening in the sudden hush. Through the small window, he saw her eyes, still open, still watching, but softer now, the edge of desperation dulled by warmth. The storm raged on, but in that moment, Ken felt it. A fragile victory, a bond forged in the crucible of risk, teetering on the edge of miracle and madness. The storm's roar dulled to a mournful drone as Ken Carter pressed his face to the small window between his cabin and the storage room, his breath fogging the glass. Inside that insulated haven, the mother bear lay curled around her cubs, her massive form a dark silhouette against the faint glow of a heater he'd rigged hours ago. The air in there was warm, life-giving, its tendrils seeping into fur once crusted with ice. Ken's hands, still trembling from the night's ordeal, gripped the sill, his eyes locked on the scene unfolding, a slow, fragile resurrection born of desperation and defiance. The cubs stirred first, a twitch of a paw, a faint shudder beneath the blanket he'd draped over them. Ken held his breath, heart thudding against his ribs, as their small bodies began to reclaim what the cold had stolen. One lifted its head, a weak, wobbly motion, its snout nudging the air as if tasting survival. The other followed, a soft whimper escaping, barely audible through the glass, but piercing Ken's chest like a blade. They were alive. After staring into the abyss of their stillness, that sound, that movement hit him like a wave, relief so sharp it bordered on pain. Tears pricked his eyes, unbidden and hot, and he let them fall, tracing silent paths down his weathered cheeks. The mother bear shifted, her head rising with a slowness that spoke of exhaustion beyond measure. Her eyes, those eyes that had pleaded through the storm, found him again, steady now, their glaze of death replaced by a wary clarity. She nuzzled her cubs, her snout gentle but firm, urging them closer as warmth seeped into their bones. Ken watched, mesmerized, as her tongue rasped over their fur, a mother's care unbroken by the chaos they'd endured. Her gaze never left him long, though, a sentinel's vigil, tracking his every shadow through the window. Yet there was no growl, no bared teeth, only a quiet acceptance, a trust so tentative it felt sacred. The storm raged on, its peak rattling the cabin walls, but inside that storage room, time softened. Ken kept watch, hours bleeding into one another as the cubs grew bolder. They wriggled free of the blanket, tiny paws testing the floor, their movements clumsy but alive with a spark of curiosity. One batted at the other, a playful swipe, and Ken's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile breaking through the weight of the night. The mother bear rested, her breathing deep and steady, but her ears flicked at every sound, her body a shield even in repose. She was magnificent, he thought, a titan reborn from the brink, her strength a quiet hymn beneath the wind's fury. He moved only when they slept, their soft snores a rhythm against the storm. With careful steps, he cracked the door, sliding a shallow pan of water and a slab of dried fish near the entrance. Offerings from his dwindling stores. The cold bit his hands, the wind snatching at his coat, but he retreated fast, shutting the door before the mother's eyes snapped open. She rose, sniffing the air, her gaze darting to him, then to the food. She waited, seconds stretching taut, until he backed to his side of the glass. Only then did she approach, lapping the water with a dignity that humbled him, tearing the fish with measured bites. Her cubs slept on, oblivious, and Ken felt a pang, gratitude, guilt, awe, knowing she ate for them as much as herself. 2 days passed in that fragile dance. The storm held them captive, but the storage room became a sanctuary, its walls cradling a bond Ken couldn't name. He'd sit by the window, watching the cubs tumble over each other, their strength returning with each hour, while the mother's gaze softened, her wariness easing into something like recognition. She'd pause sometimes, head tilted, as if studying him, a man who'd broken every rule to give her this chance. Ken's chest ached with it, a warmth deeper than the fire at his back. He'd saved them, yes, but they'd saved something in him too, a piece he hadn't known was lost. The storm's howl faded at times, only to surge again, a reminder of the wild beyond. Ken traced the window's edge, his reflection faint beside theirs. He'd crossed a line, man and beast sharing breath in a world that demanded distance. But in those quiet hours, he felt no regret. The mother bear met his eyes once more, her look steady, almost knowing, and Ken understood. This wasn't just survival, it was a tether, fleeting and profound, tying him to the wild heart beating on the other side of the glass. The storm broke on the third morning, its fury crumbling into a fragile stillness as sunlight pierced the clouds, casting a crystalline glow over the Alaskan wilderness. Ken Carter stood at his cabin window, the air sharp with the scent of pine and snow, watching the world transform. The thermometer crept upward, a hesitant thaw, and the wind softened to a whisper, as if nature itself exhaled after days of rage. Inside the storage room, the mother bear stirred, her massive head lifting, nostrils flaring as she scented the change. Her cubs, now lively shadows tumbling over each other, paused, their ears twitching toward the new quiet. Ken's chest tightened. It was time. He moved to the outer storage door, his boots crunching on the frost-bitten porch, each step heavy with a mix of relief and reluctance. The bears had to go, back to the wild where they belonged, before his presence blurred the line too long. His hand gripped the handle, cold metal grounding him, and he opened it wide. Sunlight streamed in, a golden flood that bathed the room, and fresh air rushed past, crisp and alive. The mother bear rose, her frame towering once more, her fur gleaming where ice had melted away. She was no longer the broken creature of that desperate night. Her strength had returned, a quiet majesty that stole Ken's breath. The cubs bounded to her side, their small bodies buzzing with energy, noses sniffing the breeze. They darted toward the doorway, then hesitated, glancing back at their mother. She stepped forward, deliberate and sure, her paws pressing deep into the snow beyond the threshold. Ken stood at a distance, his heart a steady thud, watching as she tested the ground, her head swiveling to scan the forest edge. The cubs followed, tumbling into the drifts, their playful yips echoing in the stillness. A sound so pure it cut through him, a reminder of the life he'd fought to save. At the doorway, she paused. The mother bear turned, her dark eyes finding his across the snowy expanse. Time stretched, the world holding its breath as their gazes locked. One final moment suspended between man and wild. Ken saw no fear in her, no lingering desperation, only a steady calm, a recognition that felt ancient, unspoken. His throat burned, a lump he couldn't swallow, and he raised a hand, not a wave, just a gesture, small and raw. She held his stare, her presence commanding even now, then turned away, leading her cubs toward the trees. The sun framed her, a silhouette of power and grace, her cubs bounding ahead, their near death forgotten in the joy of youth. Ken watched them go, rooted to the spot as their forms shrank against the white horizon. The forest swallowed them, branches rustling in their wake, until only their tracks remained. Deep imprints in the snow, proof of a miracle he'd barely dared believe. He lingered at the window long after, the cabin silent save for the fire's crackle, his reflection faint in the glass. He'd broken every rule, risked his life on a whim he couldn't explain. And yet, as the sun climbed higher, he knew he'd do it again. Those eyes, that trust, had shifted something in him, a crack in the armor of his solitude. In the years that followed, he'd spot bears in the distance, dark shapes against the hills, and wonder if they were hers, if those cubs had grown strong under her fierce care. But he never approached, never lifted his camera. Some things he'd learned weren't meant to be captured, their weight too vast for a lens. That night had taught him more than survival. It had peeled back the veil between him and the wild, revealing a bond deeper than rules, a truth carried in the heart. He traced the window's edge, the cold seeping through, and smiled faintly. Nature didn't forgive carelessness, but sometimes, just sometimes, it rewarded courage with a glimpse of something eternal. As the cabin door closed and the tracks of the mother bear and her cubs faded into the snow, Ken Carter didn't just witness a miracle of survival, he uncovered a piece of his soul he hadn't known was lost. This story isn't merely about enduring the brutal Alaskan storm, it's about compassion, courage, and the invisible thread binding humanity to the wild. Through every heart-stopping moment, from the bone-chilling cold to the desperate gaze of the mother bear, we're shown that sometimes breaking the rules isn't carelessness. It's the only way to hold on to what matters most: life, love, and hope. Picture yourself there, in that freezing darkness, facing a choice with no easy answer: your safety or the lives slipping away before your eyes. Ken took the harder path, and in doing so, he reminds us that humanity isn't just about self-preservation. It's about reaching out to those in need, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4. This tale leaves us with a warmth that defies the icy setting, a quiet echo that in this harsh world, kindness can still bloom. A flicker of light piercing the deepest night. It's a testament to the power of a single act, a single decision to ripple through the wild and into our hearts, forever changing how we see our place in it. If Ken's journey and the bear family's survival stirred something in you, if your heart raced with theirs through this incredible dance of man and nature, then don't miss out on more stories like this. Subscribe to our YouTube channel today by hitting that subscribe button below. Every week, we bring you authentic, heartwarming tales that remind you of the magic still alive in the world. Turn on notifications so you never miss a video, and join our growing community as we share stories of compassion, connection, and the beauty of the wild. Your support fuels this journey. Hit subscribe now and be part of something truly extraordinary.